Hi, and welcome back to our series on PhD life. I'm joined today by Lou Thomas and Aysha Bellamy, who have both recently completed their PhDs. And today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about writing your thesis. I think, first of all, thank you both for coming on today. I think probably a good thing to sort of start this discussion is to, maybe if you can just kind of tell our viewers what your thesis was about. Maybe if you can remember what your thesis title was, maybe if you can kind of try and summarize it in a sentence. And I think also, how long was your thesis? It might have very much varied between the three of us. So Lou, do you want to start first?
Yeah. So I just looked up my title because I couldn't remember it, even though I read it the other day. My title for my thesis was Knowing You, Changing Me, Individual Differences in Social Learning and Influence in Discounting Tasks. So I was essentially looking at a apparently social effect called contagion, which there are questions after my thesis about whether it was actually social or not, but the overall aim was to kind of look at this effect called social contagion, where when you learn about somebody else's preferences, you become more like them. So I was looking at that and looking for individual differences in that effect across a variety of experiments. So my thesis was composed of 4 experimental chapters, which kind of came out of one big behavioural study, was sort of split into 2 chapters. And then I had an MRI study and an online study because of the time that we did our theses, the PhD, was a lot of things were online because everybody knows what happened the last few years. But yeah, so it was in 4 chapters altogether. I had those chapters, and then I had a methods chapter, intro, and a discussion chapter, and everything altogether was about 54,000 words, I think, my entire thesis. So quite a short one, actually, to be honest. But yeah, so it was that, and I also used alternative format for submitting my thesis. So that means that instead of it being written as one monograph, you've kind of got like separate papers which are written as though they are for publication, and then you have like your methods which kind of justifies the methods that you used overall, and then your intro and discussion are like overall intros and discussions to kind of everything, but you actually write up those chapters as though they're papers. So that's how I submitted mine, because one of mine was already a published paper, so that did save time at the writing stage. That it was already I just put it in as is. So that's
great. And Aysha, what about you? What was your thesis about and how long was it?
So mine was called The Gene Culture Coevolution of Decision Making. Big mouthy title there. But basically what it was, it's sort of, I guess, the evolutionary psychology and also the social learning of why we come to make certain decisions. So I focused on learning skills, social norms or rules, and cooperative rules or helping behaviours. And we had 3 social learning studies for each of them, and also 3 agent-based models, which are kind of like caveman sims. You know, you make some fake people, make them make decisions, let them run over many, many runs, and just see what happens on the computer. So like Lou, I actually also did the alternative. So it was thesis by publication. I actually kind of combined my social learning studies into a big chapter, and that was actually published. So yeah, I had the introduction, the methods, a big social learning chapter, which was for skills and social rules, another chapter for cooperation, then 3 models, 1 for each, and then the conclusion. And mine was a bit longer than Lou's. It was actually almost at the maximum word count. I think it was 97k and over 700 pages. Yep.
Wow, yeah, that is, I believe the upper limit is 100,000 words, which includes everything. I think mine was approaching that as well. I think mine was about 90,000. I think you beat me by a couple of thousand. But I think it's probably worthwhile just kind of necessarily kind of mentioning, and I kept thinking about, is there a better way I can say this? So I'm just going to apologize for the implication of the innuendo that's about to come, but bigger does not necessarily mean better. I thought for a very long time, is there a better way to phrase that can circumvent that necessarily innuendo? I apologize. Nonetheless, I think the point is that it doesn't necessarily mean writing more always reflects kind of better kind of quality of work. For example, I always kind of look at mine now. I've got mine here. It's very
nice.
I mean, what is really good for it now? I think it's got very little value to actually read what's inside. But if I'm ever kind of angry,
oh yeah,
that was a shoebox. Wow. It's full.
Yeah, mine's on the coffee table. It's a ring-bound print.
I think, of course, also, if we not necessarily about academic work, I mean, I don't think mine is particularly that great. I think I've become a lot better over the last couple of years, but also in just popular culture, I can think of lots of examples where certain books Like The Hobbit, for me, it's a short book, and it's far better than Lord of the Rings. The early Harry Potter books are quite short, and they get longer as they go. But frankly, I wasn't as big of a fan as the later Harry Potter years. I don't know if you kind of agree with me. We're probably digressing from the point, but
I definitely agree with The Hobbit, actually, and Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
I still enjoy the Lord of the Rings books, but The Hobbit is just it is an easier read, isn't it? It's the kind of
I've appreciated people that can just get to the point, and I think it's something I've kind of learned over the course of time after doing my thesis, is just get to the point a little bit more is a lot better. Save everyone a bit of time and not write.
I am quite concise in my writing, which is clear by the fact that it was half the length.
Yeah.
Lou had to help me, actually.
I helped Aysha edit her thesis. Actually, I edited quite a lot of words out of Aysha's thesis for her by making.
I was over until Lou helped me generously.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably worth kind of just sort of, I guess, addressing this point. I mean, although it can vary a little bit by how many words you use, me and Aysha decided to use them like they were going out of fashion. Lou, you decided to be very concise, which is probably a good thing. Still, regardless, at the end, the lower end of the scale, which Lou was at, I think you said 54,000, was that correct?
Yeah, it's about 54.
That's still a lot. Then I think anyone coming into, anyone coming into a PhD, thinking about doing one or maybe just starting, it's a lot of words. And I remember at the beginning and thinking about when I was about to do a PhD, I was like, how am I going to do this? That's more words than I've ever considered writing. Are there any kind of words of reassurance you might be able to give to someone who's kind of starting out and a little bit feeling overwhelmed by the idea of writing a thesis?
Kind of as you go through, sorry, my guinea pigs just started squeaking. As you go through your PhD and you like write more things and you get more used to writing things, you write so many things, even if you haven't kind of contributed to your thesis with things, like you write abstracts for stuff, you write little summaries of the research that you're doing, you get so used to kind of like writing things down that it just becomes easier as you go through. So even though it feels overwhelming at first, you do so much writing all the time that it just starts to feel more normal and less overwhelming. And also, if you do find it overwhelming to sit down and write stuff, because I do sometimes, I have ADHD, so I do struggle to sit down and write, I dictate what I want to say to myself and record it. If I don't feel like sitting down and writing, I record instead, and then you can get your words and your thoughts out that way. And you can get quite a lot of words down or your thoughts down by just recording yourself. You can even get software that transcribes it for you if you want to do that. Like, it makes writing feel a lot easier. But there are kind of like, you will be writing things all of the time. Writing will feel more easy. In your first year, for most things, you end up writing like a literature review for your first thing at that point, and you get feedback on that in your kind of annual review and from your supervisors and things. And the more you kind of write and get used to it and putting your thoughts down on paper, the easier it gets, to be honest. It does feel overwhelming at the beginning, but it feels overwhelming at the beginning because you haven't got the knowledge or the experience yet that you're going to put into that document. Like, as you go along, you get all of the skills and you know what you're doing. So for me, not something at all that I would recommend doing, but I wrote my thesis in a very short period of time, right at the end of my PhD, but it wasn't like I was sort of starting a writing project from scratch. I'd spent the past 3.5 years thinking about what I was doing and getting all of that knowledge in my head. So I was kind of writing, but it wasn't from nowhere. Like, you've got all of that kind of building up anyway. So it's sort of, you start and you think like, I have no idea what I'm going to write, and it feels like a lot, but you're about to spend like the next few years thinking about basically nothing but that when you're at work. Like, the words will they'll come, like it just comes. Like, it feels like a lot at first, but it gets easier as it goes along. It's overwhelming at the beginning because it's everything. It's not just the thesis, it's all of the knowledge that you're going to have to pick up to put into the thesis that is coming as well. But that, as that comes, it gets easier. So just keep going. You've got it, you can do it, it's fine.
You do it, guys. And just to jump on that, like, my main tip, I think, for like, where do I start, you start with project ideas, right? You're talking about what studies you want to do, your supervisor, then you have to like make notes of what you're going to do in detail for the ethics anyway. So I would always start with writing the methods section of the study, because you know what you've done, and if you write it as you're doing it, you won't forget anything. And then you have a methods section done, and then you're started, so then you'll just carry on going. So the methods for me was always the easiest place to start writing a chapter.
Oh, absolutely. I've always found, even to this day, if I'm writing a new piece of research, I always start with the method section. It's just the easiest thing. It's just kind of almost just recalling what you did. It's not sort of too difficult to do. You know, I think what Lou said about, you know, at the beginning, it's kind of like, it's kind of okay. You know, it's tough to kind of know where all those words are going to come from, but that's because you haven't really yet started, is a really kind of good point. Because when I look back on when I started my PhD, the first 6 months, I remember I did little bits of writing. I was doing lots of reading, trying to do little bits of writing for kind of my annual review meetings and things. And words were just really, really tough at that point in time. To like trying to kind of string 4 pages together in a way that I felt kind of happy with was quite a tough ask. And then about 2.5 years later, I wrote 300 pages. And actually, similar to you, Lou, I did a lot of the writing at the end. But that's because that sort of 2 years in between, there's a lot that happens. You know, there's a lot of knowledge building that you and ability to write more concisely, ability to write more strongly. It's all kind of retained in your head, so it's just easier to put down on paper. So nowadays, you know, writing, you know, a paper for me takes very little amount of time in comparison to when I kind of think when I started my PhD. You know, writing just one study would take me a couple of weeks to do. Now I might be able to, if I find 2 days, I can write it in 2 days. And that was kind of similar to me towards the end of my PhD. I could write a lot of the stuff within a few days. Wouldn't necessarily recommend leave it all to the end, but certainly don't worry too much if you're kind of struggling at the beginning to kind of get lots of words down on paper. It's quite normal. I think it seems to be something that was common for the 3 of us.
And you can always edit, right? Like, you know, the first draft of anything is terrible. Like, it's easier to edit once you've dumped everything on.
I do a lot of editing in my brain, so I will like work out what I'm going to say before I write. When I was writing my thesis, so because I wrote it all in such a short period of time, so most of it, apart from the published paper and sort of paragraphs here and there, were written in the last 6 weeks, I would spend like a couple of hours in bed in the morning thinking about what I was going to write with my coffee, like before I'd even sat at my computer. So I edit before it even goes on the page, because I can't sit and focus on a page and edit it too much. So I'm thinking about what I'm going to say and editing it in my head before it even goes down. So I try and skip out that step, because I find that step quite hard, actually. So I write very concisely, because it's like a bit of a protection for myself to not have to keep reading the same thing over and over.
Sometimes when I'm like confused about the order of things, I'll like stop writing it as a chapter and like do it as like a talk or something, even if you don't present it anyway.
Really good. If you can explain it of something, if you can explain it, that's a brilliant way to, or a flow chart on a bit of paper if you're struggling with getting the words on the page, just like what order makes sense. And even just like writing paragraphs separately, like if you're doing an introduction, I never start with like the first paragraph of the introduction. I always write that last, even after I've written the final paragraph of the intro. That one is the last thing I write. I start with like, this research is important, I'm going to kind of explain why this is important, and then I'll change the paragraphs around later based on what order makes the most sense. Then I'll write my thing at the end, which says what I'm going to do at the end of my intro, and then right at the beginning of that, I'll work out where the gaps are and I'll write the first paragraph. Like,
yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really kind of good point, just to kind of reinforce, really, is that sometimes writing isn't necessarily, you start with, okay, first word of the thesis, what's it going to be? You know, just start somewhere which feels like it works. I mean, Aysha, you mentioned earlier about method sections. I think it's a good point, but even within maybe writing an introduction for a research paper, sometimes it's just, let's just deal with the bit that seems easiest. I know I need to, for example, explain this theory and explain the evidence supporting this theory. Okay, fine. I can start on that and then work maybe towards, you know, the first part of the introduction, setting up the research, or maybe I'm just going to write my hypotheses, and you kind of then eventually start to kind of piece it together. So, you know, I think sometimes a good piece of advice is, it may seem logical to start with the first paragraph of your thesis, but sometimes that doesn't always readily come to you. So just write something, just make progress on something that feels like you can achieve that day. And you can start to piece it together a little bit more as you start to amount these various documents and various paragraphs and pages to really kind of make that final piece together.
You should try to work with your brain. Like, if some days you're just like, I cannot write today, then find something else to do. Then there are some days you wake up and you surprise yourself, like, oh, I'm in the mood to write today. So then you do, even if there's not anything, you know, that's pressing. You can get a bit of a literature review done, and get a bit of like conclusion done. Just little bits to chip away at, really.
I think that's a great point. Sometimes, you know, the answers always don't just necessarily come to you, and you know, sometimes the best thing to do is just not focus on it. Maybe, okay, I'm just going to look at some statistics today instead, and just do some SPSS. Or if you're doing a qualitative work, you know, I'm just going to analyze some of my, you know, whether I'm going to do a thematic analysis, for example, and then go back to it at a later date. Suddenly I find sometimes, you know, during my PhD, but also afterwards, there are things you struggle with writing, like trying to get something down on paper in a way that makes sense. And if you try and force it, it often really doesn't work. Sometimes you just need to take a step back for 2 or 3 days and go back to it. And then suddenly I can see it now. So
explaining it to a layperson as well.
Yes, that's a good one. Yeah. Absolutely.
I was like living with my parents during COVID, and actually it was great because every time I got stuck on a paragraph and I was like, what am I trying to say? I just go find like my mum or dad and I just like talk at them. I don't think they understood what was happening, but like when they were trying to follow it and I was trying to explain it to them. Yeah, it's really helps.
I also, every time I went for a drive anywhere, I turned on my recorder on my phone, didn't have any music on or anything, and if anything came out like while I was driving, I just spoke to my phone, and that helped me a lot. So as well as actually physically deliberately recording myself, the times when I'm most likely to speak to myself, I was like, I'll turn that on, and if anything good comes out, I'll use that later. And even if I don't listen back to it, often I don't listen back to the recording, but it's the act of speaking out loud and wording things how you want them to be worded that is really useful, which is also really useful for presenting and Viva prep, because my default way of explaining my research is to speak it, because that's so much of what I did. So when it came to the Viva, I was just like, this is second nature. This is what I do all the time. I communicate best in words.
You had a great
Viva. I've been doing the whole time. So
no corrections.
I mean, I think it's probably worth also saying, you know, it sounds like we all have a kind of similar style of approaching writing where, you know, we don't necessarily do it in always a linear fashion. And it can be a little bit open-ended, you know, try and write something. You might do a little bit of your method section one day, and then maybe you might write results of a different study another day. At the same time, I think it's probably also worth just outlining, because it can probably seem a little bit so open-ended, it can seem maybe a little bit overwhelming. That doesn't mean that isn't at the same time sort of structured. You know, your supervisor, for example, will, you know, want you to turn around pieces of work in a timely fashion. They will make sure that you're kind of keeping on track. So, you know, for example, in my first year, I turned around a draft of my literature review. I may have had other sections of my thesis kind of partially sketched out. Maybe my literature review still needed a bit more work, but I had substantiated that first kind of important chapter of my thesis by then. And even then I made edits in year 3. But it's probably quite worthwhile just kind of making it clear to any of our listeners that, you know, you will have a supervisor that will kind of guide you along the process. And it isn't just, you know, a free-for-all, write 50,000 words, off you go, see you in 3 years. And I guess kind of leading on to that, maybe you can kind of embellish a bit further, but what other kind of support did you get writing a thesis? Lou, you mentioned obviously that your supervisor looks at your work. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of feedback you received, as well as maybe other kind of support that you might get during writing your thesis.
Yeah, so I mean, even kind of coming back to like presentations, a lot of the time, so every time I presented anything, I would do like draft versions of it with Josh, my supervisor, and then he would help me with wording things as well there too. So we would talk through how to word things. When I'd like go to do it, putting chapters together, and we'd talk about chapters, we often talk about how we think the best way to structure it might be and why, and just having that conversation with somebody else, like structuring the introduction to do it like this, to have this thing first, that thing next, that's what would make sense, things like that, how to structure methods, just going over things and giving feedback to make sure that it is clear what you're writing, so kind of commenting on your work and making sure that it's clear. But overall, like the kind of first big thing is, if you're going to structure something, your supervisor can help you like make a logical structure for how to put your thoughts together. If you're struggling with that, like you can kind of sit together and brainstorm about what order things are going to go in. Like there'll be an author on the paper as well if you have papers, like that you can structure things together. If you're even if the overarching picture is unclear, you can work through things like that together as well. So it's not just editing work after you've already written it. They can be involved, like the whole, like the thought process time, everything. So they can be involved there, and the editing later, just at the whole step. If you want input from your supervisor, talk to them. Like they're there to help them.
Aysha, have you got anything to add in regards to kind of support that people might get for writing a thesis? Anything maybe more about your supervisor or any other kind of support that can be useful?
Yeah, definitely. So with my supervisors, you know, and you have two, I always kind of had it so like one chapter would be with one would be another one. So, you know, you're not wasting time in a way. But more broadly than the supervisors, other PhD students are a life send. Such a lovely office, we would all read each other's work. Me and Lou used to work together on the PhD. We've both since graduated. Sorry, relevant context if people don't know us. But, you know, we'd read each other's work. Everyone in the department's so lovely. They're always there for advice. And also the wider university support system. So I'm someone that I kind of quite like to write socially, actually, like have a day where I'm sat with people and I can say at the start of the day, I want to get so-and-so done, you know, and then like sit with someone and actually do it with someone. I know some people prefer, like, you know, to be completely in silence on their own to write, but I like writing with people. And, you know, at the university here, we do like writing mornings, or like writing hours. You can drop in and, you know, kind of have it a bit more structured and a bit more social. The department do writing days, and I think it is something that most universities do now, because they realise that people are more social. Also, they can be done online as well if you're still concerned about COVID. So I would definitely look up in your own university whether that is an option, if it's something that might help you. And if it's not an option, you can start it yourself. You can just like email your PhD friends and be like, hi, do you want to book out a big room one day and just sit and write together? Because, you know, having someone to say the goal to out loud, it makes you feel more committed and like you're in it together, and it's just a much nicer atmosphere, and you can bring snacks.
I made a Slack channel as well. Like when we had when COVID first started, I made a Slack channel called We Need Mr. Motivator, where everybody would like post their goals for the day in the morning, and then like writing it down and other people reacting to it. You're like, that's what I said I would do today. I will work on that. Other people know I'm doing it now.
Yeah.
So we're like,
I mean, I think that peer support, I think, is a great point to kind of leave it on, because I think it's a good point that you can learn a lot from the people that are going through the process with you. You might be doing different theses, you might be doing different research, but you're still all on that same journey, and you can all kind of rally together, support each other, you know, from a kind of personal level, emotional level, but also from the kind of writing side as well. You know, maybe looking at what somebody else has written and go, oh, maybe there's something I can learn from that and use in my own work. I think is a really nice point to kind of leave it on. So thank you both for coming and talking a little bit about your thesis. And
we never asked you what your thesis was about, though, Sam.
Well, that's for another discussion or a different podcast. I feel that we should keep that a secret. It's a huge secret. Actually, students who come to this university know exactly what I do, but we'll keep it a secret for others who don't know me so well. They'll have to get in touch and find out a little bit more about what I do.
Yeah.
Sorry?
As a man of mystery. That's how you do an ending, by the way. If you want to
International man of mystery. Yeah, that could very well be me. Yeah. But maybe for another day, I'll talk a little bit about what I wrote and what I do. But thank you both for coming on and talking a little bit about your thesis. And hopefully I'll see you again soon.
Yeah, see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon, guys. Bye.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye.